In a world where strength is law, King Michael is the ultimate executioner. They call him the Blood King, a tyrant who froze his heart to survive a lifetime of betrayal. He demanded a bride not for love, but for a breeding contract, a cold transaction to secure his lineage and silence his enemies. Sophia, a gentle healer from a broken pack, never asked to be a sacrifice. But when she is forced into the beast's lair, she brings the one weapon he isn't prepared for: unwavering kindness. She was sent to be a prisoner in his bed. Instead, she might just be the only one who can tame the monster. But first, she has to survive the wedding night. Chapter 1. The Tribute Bride. The wind howled through the cracks of the Silver Creek packhouse, carrying with it the biting chill of a winter that had lasted far longer than the seasons intended. Inside the infirmary, Sophia crushed dried willow bark into a fine powder, her fingers numb and stained green from her work. The supplies were dwindling just like the hope in her pack members' eyes. Silver Creek had once been prosperous, a place of running water and fat game, but the border wars and a subsequent famine had reduced them to skeletons huddling around dying fires. Sophia scraped the powder into a small jar, knowing it would only provide a few hours of relief for the elders coughing in the next room. There was nothing left to give them, no magic that could fix starvation, and the silence that hung over the packlands was heavier than the snow burying them outside. The sudden, jarring sound of the Alpha's summoning bell shattered the quiet concentration of the infirmary. It wasn't the rhythmic tolling for a meal, but the frantic, erratic clang that signaled an emergency meeting. Sophia wiped her hands on her apron and hurried toward the main hall, joining the stream of gaunt faces shuffling in the same direction. Fear was a tangible thing among them, a sharp, metallic taste on the tongue. They had nothing left to lose, which meant any news from Alpha Jacob was likely to be the final nail in their collective coffin. As she squeezed into the back of the crowded room, she saw Alpha Jacob standing on the raised dais. He looked aged beyond his years, his shoulders slumped under a burden too heavy for any one wolf to carry. Alpha Jacob cleared his throat, the sound grating in the hushed room. He spoke of a deal, a desperate bargain struck with the most powerful territory in the realm, to ensure Silver Creek received food shipments and protection from the rogues picking them off one by one. Murmurs of relief rippled through the crowd until Jacob raised a trembling hand to silence them. The salvation came with a price. The Obsidian King, the Lycan ruler known only as the Blood King, required a tribute. He did not ask for soldiers or gold, for Silver Creek had neither. He demanded a bride of breeding age, a woman to bear an heir for a king who was rumored to have a heart made of solid ice. The room plummeted into a horrified silence as the reality of the trade settled upon them. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face as the Alpha's gaze swept over the crowd, lingering on the few unmarked female wolves remaining. To be sent to King Michael was a death sentence. Stories of his cruelty were whispered in every tavern from the coast to the mountains. They said he hunted his enemies for sport, and that his castle was a tomb where laughter went to die. Jacob's voice broke as he explained that he had no choice, that the survival of the pups and the elders depended on this sacrifice. He didn't want to force anyone, but the desperation in his eyes pleaded for a volunteer. Sophia looked at the woman beside her, a young wolf clutching a starving infant, and knew that silence was no longer an option. Stepping forward felt like moving through deep water, every instinct screaming at her to run the other way. Sophia's voice was quiet but steady when she offered herself as the tribute. She was a healer, not a warrior, and perhaps her skills would make her useful enough to survive, or at least keep her alive long enough to ensure her pack was fed. The collective exhale of the pack was a mixture of relief and shame. Alpha Jacob looked at her with watery eyes, whispering a thank you that felt like an apology. There was no time for tearful goodbyes or second thoughts. The king's transport was already en route, and the contract was sealed in blood. An hour later, Sophia stood by the iron gates of the territory, a single battered trunk at her feet containing her dried herbs and a few woolen dresses. The heavy rumble of an engine approached, cutting through the howling wind. A massive black vehicle with tinted windows and reinforced tires, looking more like a tank than a car, pulled up to the curb. The back door swung open, revealing a dark, empty leather interior that looked like the mouth of a cave. A driver in a dark suit stepped out, his expression blank as he loaded her trunk without a word. As Sophia stepped toward the vehicle, leaving the only home she had ever known, she realized she wasn't just walking into a marriage. She was walking into the den of a monster, and the heavy lock of the car door clicking shut behind her sounded exactly like the closing of a prison cell. Chapter 2. Into the Obsidian Fortress. The journey to the Lycan King's domain was a grueling passage through changing landscapes, where the familiar forests of Silver Creek gave way to jagged cliffs and desolate rocky plains that seemed incapable of sustaining life. Sophia sat in the back of the armored vehicle for hours, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching the world grow darker and more hostile through the tinted glass. The driver remained a silent sentinel in the front, offering no words of comfort or explanation, leaving Sophia alone with her escalating dread. As they crossed a massive iron bridge spanning a churning black river, the destination finally loomed into view. The Obsidian Fortress did not look like a home. It looked like a weapon carved from the mountain itself. Towers of black stone pierced the gray sky, and high walls topped with spikes encircled a structure that radiated power and cruelty. It was a place built for war, not for a family, and certainly not for a healer who spent her days tending to gardens and broken bones. The vehicle passed through the massive main gates, which groaned open with the sound of grinding metal, and came to a halt in a sprawling paved courtyard. Dozens of guards clad in dark gray tactical gear patrolled the perimeter, their movements sharp and disciplined. Unlike the relaxed, familial atmosphere of her pack, these wolves moved with the precision of machines. The door clicked unlock, and Sophia stepped out into the biting wind, hugging her thin coat closer to her body. Before she could even reach for her trunk, the main doors of the keep flew open. A silence fell over the courtyard, heavy and absolute, as the king emerged. Michael was larger than any wolf she had ever seen, his human form towering over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the light. He wore black combat trousers and a simple dark shirt that strained against his muscles, but it was his face that froze the breath in her lungs. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, and his eyes were pools of molten gold that held no warmth, only a chilling, predatory assessment. Michael descended the stone steps with a prowling grace that terrified her more than his size. He stopped a few feet away, his scent hitting her like a physical blow, a mix of metallic iron, wet earth, and something deeply masculine that made her inner wolf whimper in submission. He did not greet her. He did not welcome her. He simply stared at her as if she were a puzzle he needed to dismantle. He gestured to his guards with a sharp flick of his wrist, pointing at her battered trunk. 2 guards immediately seized it, dumping the contents onto the cold paving stones. Her meticulously dried herbs, her few changes of clothes, and her small journal scattered across the ground. Sophia gasped, instinctively stepping forward to protect her belongings, but a low, vibrating growl from Michael froze her in place. He stepped closer, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the soles of her shoes. He declared that no item entered his fortress without inspection, his tone devoid of apology. He kicked through her pile of clothes with a heavy boot, his golden eyes scanning for weapons, poisons, or communication devices. He picked up a bundle of dried sage, sniffing it with suspicion before crushing it in his fist and letting the dust fall to the ground. Sophia watched in humiliation, realizing he wasn't just being cruel. He was checking her for threats. He truly believed a healer from a starving pack might be an assassin sent to end him. After satisfying his paranoia that she carried no blades, he locked eyes with her again. He told her that she was here to serve a purpose, not to be a guest, and ordered her to gather her things quickly. As she scrambled to collect her scattered life from the dirt under the watchful eyes of his army, Sophia realized the rumors were wrong. He wasn't just a monster. He was a man consumed by a fear so deep it had turned into hatred. Chapter 3. A Vow Without Love. The preparations for the wedding were as stark and joyless as the fortress itself. Sophia was ushered into a guest chamber by a trembling maid who refused to make eye contact, her hands shaking as she laid out a dress of heavy, cream-colored silk. The gown was beautiful but archaic, smelling faintly of cedar as if it had been locked away in a chest for decades. There were no flowers, no music, and no family to stand beside her. Sophia dressed in silence, the heavy fabric feeling like a shroud against her skin. She braided her hair with trembling fingers, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. She did not look like a bride. She looked like a sacrifice prepared for the altar. When the guards came to retrieve her, they flanked her like she was a prisoner being escorted to execution, marching her down long, drafty corridors, lit only by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows against the stone walls. The great hall was cavernous and empty, save for a bored-looking magistrate and the king himself. Michael stood at the altar, his back to the room, staring up at a faded tapestry depicting a great battle. He had not changed into formal wear. He wore the same dark clothes from the courtyard, a stark visual reminder that he considered this union a chore rather than a celebration. As Sophia approached, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the vast silence, he turned. His expression was unreadable, his jaw set tight. He watched her walk down the aisle with the same intensity a wolf watches prey, tracking her every movement. When she reached his side, the heat radiating from his large body was overwhelming, a furnace against the chill of the room. He did not offer her his hand. The magistrate began the ceremony, his voice hurried and nervous, skipping over the flowery language of love and devotion to get straight to the binding clauses. This was a political contract, nothing more. When it came time for the vows, Michael spoke his part with a rough, clipped cadence, promising protection and provision in exchange for loyalty and lineage. Sophia's voice was a whisper, promising to honor a husband who looked at her with open disdain. Then came the moment of the marking. In their tradition, a bite was the true seal, but for a political union where trust was absent, a ceremonial cut was used to mingle their blood. Michael took a ceremonial dagger, sliced his palm, and then reached for her hand. The moment his skin brushed hers, a jolt of electricity violently snapped through the air, staggering them both. It was the undeniable, magnetic pull of the mate bond, the ancient magic recognizing its other half. Sophia gasped, her eyes widening as she looked up at him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Michael stiffened, his golden eyes flashing with a sudden, terrifying recognition. For a heartbeat, the air crackled with the potential of what they could be. Then, the walls slammed back down. Michael's face twisted into a snarl of rejection. He ruthlessly shoved the feeling down, gripping her hand tight enough to bruise, and pressed his bleeding palm against hers with brutal efficiency. He finished the ceremony not with a kiss, but by dropping her hand as if it burned him. He turned to the guards and ordered them to escort his new wife to the master suite, his voice rough and dangerous, warning her that the night had only just begun. Chapter 4. The 3 Rules. The master suite was a vast, imposing room dominated by a massive bed carved from dark mahogany, but the luxury offered no comfort to Sophia. She stood near the fireplace, the flames doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in her bones. The heavy oak door swung open, and Michael entered, filling the room with his imposing presence and the scent of storm and iron. He locked the door behind him with a decisive click that echoed like a gunshot. He didn't advance on her immediately. Instead, he paced the length of the room like a caged animal, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The tension in his jaw was so tight she thought his teeth might shatter. He was fighting the bond, fighting the biological urge to claim her that was warring with his iron resolve to keep her at a distance. He stopped his pacing abruptly and turned to face her, the firelight casting long, distorted shadows across his scarred face. He told her to listen closely because he would not repeat himself. There were to be rules in this marriage, absolutes that would define her existence within these walls. He held up one finger, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Rule number 1. She was here to provide an heir. That was the terms of the treaty with her pack. Their intimacy would be a transaction, performed only for the purpose of procreation, and she was not to mistake it for passion or affection. Sophia felt the blood rush to her cheeks, the crudeness of his words stinging more than a slap, but she held her chin up, refusing to let him see her cry. He stepped closer, invading her personal space until she had to crane her neck to look him in the eye. Rule number 2. The west wing of the castle was forbidden. It was his sanctuary, the place where he kept his counsel and his private history. If she was found past the threshold of the corridor leading to it, she would be treated as a spy and dealt with accordingly. His eyes bore into hers, searching for deceit, convinced that she was already plotting to steal his secrets. He told her that many women had tried to infiltrate his life before, and all of them had regretted it. He needed her to understand that his paranoia was not madness. It was a survival mechanism honed by years of treachery. Finally, he leaned down, his face inches from hers, his breath hot against her ear. Rule number 3, he murmured, was the most important. She was never under any circumstances to expect love from him. His heart was a stone, buried and forgotten, and he had no intention of digging it up for a tribute bride. He told her that hope was a dangerous thing in this fortress, and she would do well to kill it before it killed her. Sophia looked into the golden eyes of her mate, seeing the tortured soul beneath the layers of anger. Instead of cowering, she spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice soft but unwavering. She told him she understood the rules, but she also told him that a stone heart was a heavy burden to carry alone. Michael recoiled as if she had struck him. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the room, leaving his bride alone on their wedding night, unable to be in the same room with her without losing the control he prized above all else. Chapter 5. The First Hunt. The moon was high and full, casting a pale, ghostly light over the forbidden forest that bordered the castle grounds. Michael tore through the underbrush, his human form discarded for the massive, terrifying shape of his Lycan beast. He was a creature of nightmare, standing nearly 8 feet tall on his hind legs, with fur as black as the void and claws that could shear through plate armor. The bond was screaming in his blood, a relentless itch that demanded he return to the castle, to the woman who smelled like rain and meadows. It was unbearable. Every instinct he had was urging him to claim her, to mark her, to accept the gift fate had thrown at his feet. But Michael knew better than to trust fate. Fate was a cruel mistress who had taken everything he ever loved. So he ran. He pushed his muscles to the breaking point, his lungs burning with exertion, seeking the only release he allowed himself: violence. He caught the scent of a rogue bear, a massive male that had wandered too close to his borders. With a roar that shook the trees, Michael launched himself at the beast. The fight was brutal and short. He channeled all his sexual frustration, all his fear of the bond, and all his anger into the brawl. Claws met fur and flesh, and the metallic tang of blood filled the air, momentarily drowning out the scent of lavender that haunted his mind. He fought until his body was battered and exhausted, until the rage had dulled to a manageable throb. Standing over the carcass of the bear, panting heavily, the Lycan king felt a moment of hollow peace. He had survived another night without giving in to the weakness of his heart. He shifted back to his human form, naked and covered in gore, and began the long, limping trek back to the fortress. the cold night air soothing his overheated skin. Back in the castle, the sun was beginning to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains. Sophia had not slept. The bed was too large, too cold, and the silence of the room was oppressive. She rose with the dawn, dressing in a simple gray wool dress she had brought from home. She couldn't stay in this room. She needed to move, to do something with her hands. She cracked the door open and peered into the hallway. It was empty. She stepped out, her soft shoes making no sound on the stone floor. She wandered aimlessly, trying to memorize the layout of her prison. The castle was a labyrinth of shadows and dust. It seemed that no one had lived here in years, only existed. She turned a corner and nearly collided with a woman carrying a basket of linens. The maid, a stout woman with graying hair, dropped the basket in terror, scrambling back against the wall as if Sophia were a ghost. Sophia immediately crouched down to help gather the linens, apologizing softly. The maid, whose name was Martha, stared at her in shock. She had expected the king's new wife to be imperious and cruel, or perhaps a weeping victim. She did not expect a young woman who helped servants pick up laundry. Sophia smiled, a genuine tired smile, and asked where the kitchens were. Before Martha could answer, the heavy sound of the main doors slamming open echoed through the hall. Sophia froze. She looked down the corridor to see Michael standing at the entrance to the wing. He was covered in dried mud and blood, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and feral. He spotted her interacting with the maid, and his expression darkened instantly, the predator returning from the hunt to find someone meddling in his territory. Chapter 6. The Dead Garden. Sophia watched Michael storm past her in the hallway, the heavy scent of iron and wet earth trailing in his wake like a warning banner. He did not speak to her, nor did he acknowledge the terrified maid trembling against the wall, but the sheer force of his anger was enough to make the stone floor beneath their feet seem to vibrate. Once he had disappeared into his private wing, the heavy door slamming shut with a finality that echoed through the corridor, Sophia helped Martha stand. The older woman muttered a hurried apology and scurried away, leaving Sophia alone once more in the oppressive silence of the fortress. She needed to escape the stone walls, if only for an hour. Following a draft of fresh air, she navigated the winding corridors until she found a heavy wooden door that led to the rear of the castle. Stepping outside, she expected to find the untamed wilderness of the forest she had seen upon arrival. Instead, she found herself standing on the edge of what had once been a magnificent royal garden. Now, it was a graveyard of flora. The rose bushes were nothing but tangles of vicious thorns, brown and brittle. The fountains were dry, their basins filled with dead leaves and stagnant rainwater. Gray weeds choked the pathways, and the ancient oak trees that lined the perimeter looked skeletal against the overcast sky. It was a place of utter desolation, a perfect reflection of the king who ruled it. But where others saw death, Sophia saw dormancy. She knelt by a patch of hardened earth, her fingers tracing the faint, struggling pulse of a root system beneath the soil. Hours passed as she worked. She found a rusted trowel in a dilapidated shed and began to clear the choking weeds from a bed of lavender that was fighting to survive. The physical labor was grounding, the ache in her muscles a welcome distraction from the fear that constantly gnawed at her belly. She was so engrossed in pruning the dead wood from a rose bush that she didn't hear the heavy footsteps approaching on the stone path. It wasn't until a shadow fell over her, blocking out the weak afternoon light, that she froze. Slowly, she looked up to find Michael standing over her. He had washed the blood from his skin and changed into fresh black tactical gear, but his hair was still damp, and his eyes were burning with suspicion. He didn't ask what she was doing. He accused her. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble as he demanded to know what she was burying. He stepped into the garden bed, his heavy boots crushing the weeds she had just pulled, and grabbed her wrist. He was convinced she was planting drops, small, magical markers used by spies to signal their location to enemy trackers. He believed her gardening was a ruse, a cover for treachery. Sophia winced at the tightness of his grip, but didn't pull away. She met his furious gaze with a calm that baffled him, holding up the trowel and the handful of dead roots. She explained quietly that she was not planting signals, but clearing the rot so something new could grow. Michael stared at the dirt on her hands, searching her face for the lie, but found only a quiet defiance. He released her wrist with a scoff, telling her that nothing grew in his domain and that she was wasting her time trying to bring life to a place built on death. Chapter 7. Silent Acts of Rebellion. The confrontation in the garden did nothing to deter Sophia. If anything, it solidified her resolve. Michael expected her to cower in her room or plot his demise in the shadows, so she decided to do the one thing he couldn't predict. She made herself at home. Over the next few days, the obsidian fortress began to change in subtle, quiet ways that unnerved its master. Sophia started with the light. The heavy velvet drapes that had been drawn for years, plunging the hallways into perpetual twilight, were pulled open. Gray morning light flooded the corridors, revealing dust motes dancing in the air and illuminating the forgotten tapestries on the walls. She swept the hearths in the common rooms and convinced the terrified staff to light fires, chasing away the damp chill that had settled into the stones. Michael watched these changes from the security monitors in his command center located deep within the West Wing. The bank of screens showed him every corner of his fortress, save for the private quarters. He sat in his leather chair, his brow furrowed as he watched his wife move through the castle. He saw her stop to speak with the guards, not to seduce them or extract information, but to ask about their families or offer them a warm drink. He watched her in the kitchens, helping the cook chop vegetables, laughing softly at something the old woman said. It was maddening. He kept waiting for the slip, for the moment she would sneak into his office or try to bribe a sentry. Instead, she was weaving a spell of domesticity that felt more dangerous than any assassin's blade. One afternoon, the monitors captured a scene that made Michael grip the arms of his chair until the leather creaked. A young servant boy had dropped a heavy cauldron of boiling water in the scullery, scalding his arm. On the screen, Michael saw Sophia rush forward. She didn't call for a doctor or recoil in disgust. She knelt on the wet stone floor, her hands glowing with the faint, soft light of her healer's magic. She pressed her palms to the boy's angry red skin, her face twisted in concentration as she drew the pain out of him and into herself. The boy stopped crying, looking at her with something akin to worship. Michael felt a strange phantom ache in his own chest as he watched. He knew that using healer magic was exhausting. It drained the user's vitality. She was weakening herself for a servant she didn't know. He turned off the monitor, the screen fading to black, but the image of her glowing hands burned in his mind. It had to be a performance. No one was that selfless, certainly not a wolf from a desperate pack that had sold her like cattle. She was building loyalty among his staff, turning his own people to her side so she could strike when his guard was down. He convinced himself of this narrative because it was the only one that made sense, the only one that kept his walls intact. He stood up, pacing the small room, and decided that he could no longer watch from the shadows. He needed to break her facade. He needed to look her in the eye and terrify the truth out of her. He hit the intercom button on his desk, his voice barking an order to the kitchen staff. The Queen would dine with him tonight, and she would answer for her behavior. Chapter 8. The Dinner from Hell. The dining hall was a cavernous room designed to seat 100 warriors, making the setup for two feel absurdly isolating. A long table of polished black wood stretched down the center, with Michael seated at the head, and Sophia placed at the far end, an expanse of dark mahogany separating them like a canyon. The only light came from a massive iron chandelier overhead, and the two candelabras placed strategically to cast long shadows over their plates. The meal was a silent affair at first, the only sounds being the scrape of silverware against porcelain and the crackle of the fireplace. Michael ate with mechanical efficiency, his eyes never leaving Sophia. She wore a dress of deep blue velvet, one she had found in the castle wardrobes, and though she looked small in the high-backed chair, she sat with a straight spine, meeting his gaze whenever she dared. Michael broke the silence with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He didn't ask how her day was. He asked her to detail the specific training she received in her former pack. He wanted to know about her knowledge of poisons, her experience with interrogation resistance, and who had taught her to manipulate the emotions of others. Sophia set her fork down, her appetite vanishing. She answered him calmly, explaining that her training involved anatomy, herbalism, and the flow of energy through the body. She told him she knew how to stop a heart, yes, but only so she could restart it. She knew poisons because she needed to know the antidotes. Every answer she gave was logical, honest, and devoid of the deceit he was hunting for, which only served to agitate him further. He pushed his plate away, the porcelain clattering loudly. He leaned forward, the candlelight flickering in his golden eyes, and accused her of playing a long game. He told her that her kindness to the staff was a transparent tactic to gain leverage. Sophia finally showed a spark of anger. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, and asked him if it was so impossible to believe that she was simply a person who preferred kindness to cruelty. She asked him who had hurt him so badly that he saw a weapon in a smile. The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Michael's expression hardened into granite. He hadn't expected her to psychoanalyze him. He expected her to deny or beg. Emboldened by his silence, or perhaps reckless from the tension, Sophia's gaze dropped to the jagged scar running down his neck, disappearing into his collar. She asked him, her voice softening, where the mark had come from. It was the wrong question. Michael slammed his fist onto the table, the force of the blow causing the wine glasses to jump and tip over, spilling red liquid like blood across the dark wood. A low growl ripped from his throat, his human eyes momentarily bleeding into the glowing amber of his wolf. He stood up so abruptly his chair fell backward with a crash. He told her that his scars were none of her concern, and that she should focus on her duty to provide an heir rather than digging into his past. He looked at her with a mixture of rage and panic, realizing that her questions were stripping away his armor faster than any blade. Unable to stand the scrutiny of her gentle eyes, he turned and stormed out of the hall, leaving her alone with the spilled wine and the echo of his fury. Chapter 9. The Midnight Injury. It was well past midnight when the sound of the side door crashing open woke Sophia from a fitful sleep. She had been lying in the massive bed, staring at the canopy, replaying the disastrous dinner in her mind. The noise was followed by the heavy, uneven thud of boots dragging against stone, a sound that triggered her healer's instinct instantly. She didn't stop to think about the rules or Michael's temper. She grabbed her robe, tying it quickly around her waist, and rushed into the corridor. The hallway was dim, lit only by the dying embers in the wall sconces, but the smell of fresh copper and musk was unmistakable. Michael was leaning heavily against the wall near the entrance to the west wing, one hand pressed tight against his side, dark liquid seeping through his fingers. He had been patrolling the perimeter, restless after their argument, when a group of rogue wolves had tested the southern defenses. He had slaughtered them, but one had gotten lucky with a serrated blade. When he heard Sophia's light footsteps, he pushed himself off the wall, trying to straighten up and mask the pain. He snarled at her to go back to bed, baring his teeth in a warning that lacked its usual heat. He looked pale, his skin slick with sweat, the adrenaline of the fight fading to reveal the exhaustion beneath. Sophia ignored his command. She walked straight up to him, her eyes dropping to the wound. It was deep, a jagged tear that would need stitching and a poultice to prevent infection from the rogue's dirty blade. She told him he was bleeding on the carpet and that if he didn't let her treat it, he would ruin the floor. It was a practical, almost scolding remark that caught him off guard. Before he could protest, she reached out. He flinched as if she held a hot iron, but she didn't pull back. Her small, warm hands covered his large, blood-soaked ones, gently prying them away from the injury. The moment skin met skin, the air in the hallway seemed to vanish. The mate bond surged, not with the violent snap of the wedding ceremony, but with a warm, terrifying comfort. Michael felt the pain in his side dull, replaced by a heat that radiated from her touch and settled deep in his chest. He looked down at her, his pupils dilating, his breath hitching in his throat. For a heartbeat, he didn't see a spy or a burden. He saw a woman who had run toward the scent of blood instead of away from it. He found himself leaning into her, his forehead dropping to rest momentarily against her hair, inhaling the scent of chamomile and sleep. It was a moment of pure, unguarded weakness. Sophia froze, her heart hammering against his arm, terrified to break the spell. Then, reality crashed back in. Michael realized what he was doing. He was seeking comfort from the enemy. He shoved her away with a rough grunt, stumbling back toward his private door. He glared at her, his chest heaving, and told her to leave him alone. He retreated into the west wing and slammed the heavy door, locking it from the inside. Sophia stood in the empty hallway, her hands stained with his blood, knowing that for a split second, the monster had wanted to be held. Chapter 10. The Diplomatic Summit. The morning brought a flurry of activity that shattered the gloomy routine of the fortress. Sophia was in the library, trying to distract herself with a book on regional history, when the heavy wooden doors swung open. It wasn't Michael, but Beta Garin, the king's second-in-command. He was a stern man with gray temples and a perpetual frown. Though he had never been unkind to her, he informed her that a messenger had arrived from the Council of Alphas. A diplomatic summit was to be held at the Obsidian Fortress in 3 days to discuss the shifting borders and the rogue threat. This was not a casual visit. Every major alpha in the region would be in attendance, along with their retinues and advisors. The castle, usually a tomb of silence, was about to become a chaotic pit of vipers. Michael found her an hour later in the solar. He looked as if he hadn't slept, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes, and his movement was stiff, betraying the injury he had refused to let her treat. He didn't mention the night in the hallway. Instead, he launched into a briefing that sounded more like a threat assessment. He told her that the summit was a dangerous game. His enemies would be walking through his front door, drinking his wine, and looking for any sign of weakness to exploit. He paced the room, his agitation palpable. He explained that among the guests would be Lord Vane, a council member with ambition that far outstripped his morals. Vane had been eyeing Michael's territories for years, waiting for the king to slip. Michael stopped in front of her, his shadow falling over the chair where she sat. He gave her a strict directive. She was to be invisible. She would stand by his side during the formal introductions, but she was not to speak, not to offer opinions, and certainly not to wander off alone with any of the guests. He warned her that Vane was charming and manipulative, a man who used words like daggers. Michael's eyes narrowed as he told her that, if she was caught passing information to Vane or any other alpha, he would not hesitate to execute her as a traitor, regardless of the bond. It was a harsh reminder of where she stood, not a queen, but a potential liability. Sophia nodded, accepting his commands with a stoic grace, though the accusation stung. She saw the fear behind his aggression. He was terrified that she would see a better option in another alpha and turn on him. As the day of the summit approached, the castle transformed. Servants scrubbed the stone floors until they shone. Banners of the Lycan house were unfurled, and the scent of roasting meats filled the air. But beneath the pageantry, the tension was suffocating. On the evening the guests began to arrive, carriages and armored SUVs lining the driveway. Sophia stood at the top of the grand staircase next to her husband. She felt his hand brush hers, not to hold it, but to check that she was there. As the heavy doors opened to reveal a sea of unfamiliar faces, She realized that the danger inside the castle was about to match the danger outside, and she was standing directly in the crossfire. Chapter 11. The Test of Loyalty. The Great Hall had been transformed from a cold, echoing cavern into a display of opulent power, yet the atmosphere remained as welcoming as a tomb. Chandeliers dripping with crystals cast a prismatic glow over the gathered dignitaries, illuminating the velvet doublets and silk gowns of the visiting alphas and their consorts. Sophia stood near a pillar of dark marble, holding a flute of sparkling water she had no intention of drinking. She wore a gown of silver silk that shimmered like moonlight against water, a stark contrast to the obsidian gloom of the fortress. Michael was nowhere near her. He was on the other side of the room, surrounded by a group of older alphas, his posture rigid and his face a mask of polite disinterest. Though he appeared engaged in conversation, Sophia felt the weight of his gaze on her every few seconds, a heavy, physical sensation that prickled along her skin. He was waiting. He was watching for the moment she would slip, the moment she would signal to an enemy or whisper a secret. It did not take long for the vultures to circle. A man separated himself from the crowd and approached her with a smooth, predatory grace. He was handsome in a polished, superficial way, with slicked-back blonde hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his icy blue eyes. This was Lord Vane, the council member Michael had warned her about. He bowed low, taking her hand and pressing a lingering kiss to her knuckles that made her skin crawl. He introduced himself with a voice like oiled silk, complimenting her dress and lamenting that such a radiant flower had been planted in such a desolate garden. He leaned in closer, invading her personal space under the guise of intimacy, and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He spoke of Michael's reputation, calling him a beast who knew only war, and suggested that a woman of her delicate nature must be suffering terribly under the weight of the king's cruelty. Sophia saw the trap immediately. Vane was fishing, offering her a sympathetic ear in exchange for a complaint, a grievance, anything he could use to paint Michael as unfit to rule or to blackmail him later. Across the room, Michael had gone perfectly still. He was no longer feigning interest in the alphas. He was staring directly at them, his knuckles white as he gripped his wine glass. He expected her to fold. He expected her to tell Vane about the cold wedding night, the threats, and the isolation. Sophia slowly withdrew her hand from Vane's grip, her expression remaining serene and unbothered. She pitched her voice just loud enough to be heard by the nearby guests, ensuring there was no ambiguity in her words. She told Lord Vane that he was mistaken. She explained that while the obsidian fortress was indeed imposing, it stood as a testament to the strength required to protect the realm from chaos. She looked him dead in the eye and declared that her husband was not a beast, but a king who bore the scars of his burdens so that others did not have to. Her loyalty was not to the walls, but to the man who held them up. The smile on Vane's face faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation before he quickly masked it. He had expected a frightened girl. He had found a queen. Across the hall, Michael exhaled slowly, the glass in his hand remaining intact. He turned back to the alphas, but the tension in his shoulders had vanished. For the first time in decades, someone had stood between him and a dagger, and the realization left him shaken to his core. Chapter 12. The Assassination. The following morning, the diplomatic summit commenced in the central war room, a circular chamber dominated by a massive table carved from a single slab of granite. The mood was tense, fueled by old rivalries and the abundance of caffeine and ego in the room. Sophia sat quietly to Michael's right, her hands folded in her lap, fulfilling her role as the silent ornament. Michael was in his element here, his mind sharp and ruthless as he navigated the disputes over territory lines and trade tariffs. Lord Vane sat directly across from them, his smile pleasant, but his eyes watchful, tapping a gold pen against the table in a rhythmic, irritating staccato. The meeting dragged on for hours, the air growing stale and warm, until the doors opened for the midday meal service. Servers dressed in the fortress livery streamed in, carrying silver platters of roasted meats and heavy carafes of wine. The disruption caused a momentary lapse in focus as alphas turned to fill their plates. It was in that chaotic shuffle of movement that the rhythm of the room changed. Sophia, trained to notice the smallest details in a patient's demeanor, saw a server's hand tremble as he reached for a knife on the sideboard. It wasn't the tremble of nerves, it was the adrenaline of intent. Before she could scream a warning, the server lunged at the alpha sitting closest to the door. The room exploded into violence. Half the serving staff drew concealed blades, their liveries tearing away to reveal light armor underneath. These were not servants. They were assassins. Michael reacted with the speed of a lightning strike. He flipped the heavy granite table with a roar, using it as a shield to protect Sophia and the elder council members from the first volley of throwing knives. Then he shifted. The sound of tearing fabric and cracking bone filled the room as the king unleashed the Lycan. He grew to a monstrous size, his fur bristling like needles, his roar shaking the dust from the ceiling rafters. He was a blur of lethal efficiency, tearing through the assassins with swipes of his massive claws that rendered their armor useless. He moved with a brutality that was terrifying to behold, protecting his guests by becoming the most dangerous thing in the room. The fight was over in less than 2 minutes. The assassins lay broken on the floor, their ambush a failure against the raw power of the Lycan king. But as the silence returned, heavy with the copper tang of blood, Michael did not shift back. He stood in the center of the carnage, breathing heavily, a low, pained whine escaping his throat. Embedded deep in his left shoulder was a small black dagger. It wasn't a fatal wound for a Lycan, but the veins around the injury were turning a necrotic black, spreading like a spiderweb under his fur. The blade was coated in a potent mixture of wolfsbane and concentrated silver nitrate. The poison hit his bloodstream instantly, bypassing his natural healing and sending his nervous system into a fiery, chaotic overdrive. The king stumbled, his golden eyes rolling back as the beast took full control, driven mad by the agony coursing through his veins. Chapter 13. The feral king pandemonium erupted in the war room. The visiting alphas scrambled toward the exits, their earlier bravado forgotten in the face of a feral Lycan. A poisoned Lycan was not a rational being, it was a force of indiscriminate destruction. Michael thrashed wildly, smashing into the stone walls with enough force to crack the masonry. He snapped at the air, his jaws clamping down with bone-crushing force, blind to who was friend and who was foe. His own elite guards, led by Beta Garen, rushed in with long, silver-tipped spears, forming a perimeter around their king. They looked terrified. They knew better than anyone that Michael could slaughter them all without hesitation in this state. They shouted orders to contain him, their voices cracking with fear, but no one dared to get close enough to pull the dagger out. Sophia stood near the overturned table, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched as Michael slammed his claws into the floor, gouging deep trenches into the stone, a howl of pure agony ripping from his throat. It was a sound of suffering that pierced through her fear and struck the healer's core within her. She saw the black poison spreading toward his neck, the veins bulging. If it reached his heart or his brain while he was in this heightened metabolic state, it would kill him or leave him permanently brain dead. The guards were preparing nets and tranquilizer darts, weapons that would only agitate him further and waste precious time. She took a step forward. Beta Garen grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. He shouted over the noise, telling her to get back, that the king didn't know her and would tear her apart before she could take a breath. He tried to drag her toward the safety of the rear exit, his face pale and desperate. Sophia looked at the thrashing beast, seeing the man trapped inside the monster. She ripped her arm free from Garen's grasp with a strength the beta didn't expect. She told him firmly that they were killing him with their fear, and that she was the only one who could get close without triggering his attack response. Before Garen could stop her again, she stepped past the line of spears. The room fell into a horrified silence. The guards lowered their weapons slightly, watching in disbelief as the small, unarmed woman walked calmly toward the apex predator. Michael sensed the movement. He whipped his massive head around, a snarl curling his lips back to reveal fangs the size of daggers. He crouched low, muscles coiling to spring, his eyes burning with a chemically induced madness. He didn't recognize her. To him, she was just another threat, another shadow coming to hurt him. But Sophia didn't stop. She didn't run. She walked straight into the kill zone, her hands open and empty, offering herself to the beast in a gamble that would either save his life or end hers. Chapter 14. The Healer's Courage. The smell of the room was overwhelming. Acrid poison, spilled wine, and the raw, aggressive musk of a furious Lycan. Sophia forced her breathing to slow, pushing down the primal urge to flee that screamed in the back of her mind. She locked eyes with the beast, refusing to look at the deadly claws or the poisoned dagger. She focused entirely on the golden irises that were darting frantically, searching for a target. She began to hum, a low, vibrating sound deep in her throat. It was a technique used by healers to soothe injured pups who were too frightened to be touched. It wasn't magic, but a frequency that mimicked the comforting rumble of a mother wolf. Michael froze. The sound cut through the haze of pain and rage clouding his mind. His ears twitched, rotating forward. He growled, a deep, rumbling warning that shook the floorboards, but he didn't lunge. Sophia continued to close the distance, her movements fluid and non-threatening. She spoke then, her voice pitching low and soft, calling him by his name. She didn't command him. She invited him. She told him he was safe, that the threat was gone, and that she was here to take the pain away. Every instinct in Michael's feral mind told him to strike, to eliminate the intruder, but the scent reaching him stopped him cold. Beneath the smell of blood and fear, there was lavender, rain, and the undeniable, soul-tethering scent of mate. She reached him. Standing before the massive Lycan, she was dwarfed, her head barely reaching his chest. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hands. The guards behind her held their breath, some looking away, unable to watch the slaughter they were sure was coming. Sophia placed her palms gently on either side of his massive, fur-covered snout. The contact was electric. She didn't flinch when a drop of his saliva landed on her dress. She stroked the coarse fur with her thumbs, maintaining the eye contact that challenged his dominance while offering comfort. The tension in his massive frame began to bleed away. The snarl faded, his lips covering his teeth. With a whimper that sounded heartbreakingly human, the great beast collapsed. His legs gave out, and he slumped to the floor, his head landing heavily in Sophia's arms. The shift overtook him instantly. Bones cracked and reformed, fur receded into skin, and within seconds, the terrified monster was gone. In his place lay Michael, human and naked, unconscious and pale as a sheet. The black veins were still pulsing around the wound in his shoulder. Sophia wasted no time. She barked orders at the stunned guards, her voice ringing with authority. She demanded hot water, silver forceps, and her medical kit from her chambers. She looked at Garin, who was staring at her as if she were a deity, and told him to clear the room. The king needed his wife, not an audience. Chapter 15. The Bedside Vigil. The master suite had been converted into a triage unit. Sophia had refused to let Michael be moved to the infirmary, paranoid that another assassin might be lurking among the medical staff. She trusted no one but herself. She had spent the last 2 hours carefully excising the poisoned tissue from his shoulder, her hands steady despite the exhaustion dragging at her eyelids. She had flushed the wound with a saline solution and packed it with a paste of crushed charcoal and nettle to draw out the remaining toxins. Now, the worst was over, but the fever had set in. Michael lay in the center of the massive bed, his skin burning to the touch, glistening with sweat. Sophia sat in a high-backed chair pulled right up to the bedside, a damp cloth in her hand. She wiped his forehead, murmuring soft reassurances whenever he tossed and turned. The poison had unlocked the vault of his subconscious, and the nightmares were spilling out. He wasn't the ruthless king in his sleep. He was a man haunted by ghosts. He mumbled names Sophia didn't know, pleading with them not to open the gates, begging someone named Ilara to put the knife down. It was a window into the betrayal that had frozen his heart, a raw and unfiltered confirmation of the pain he carried every day. He thrashed, gripping the sheets with white-knuckled fists, groaning that he couldn't trust her, that she was lying. Sophia knew he was dreaming of her, or perhaps confounding her with the women from his past. It broke her heart. She reached out and took his hand, interlocking their fingers. She squeezed tight, anchoring him to reality. She told him he was wrong. She told the sleeping king that she wasn't going anywhere, that she wasn't Alara, and that she didn't need a knife to hurt him, but she would never use one. She stayed there for 2 days and 2 nights. She barely ate, only drinking water when Martha brought it, refusing to leave his side even for a moment. She managed his fever with cool compresses and monitored his pulse with her own senses, using the mate bond to track his vitality. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. The gray pallor left his skin, replaced by the returning flush of health. Sophia had fallen asleep with her head resting on the mattress near his hip, her hand still clutching his. Michael stirred. His eyes fluttered open, the gold returning to them, clear and sharp. He took a deep breath, wincing at the stiffness in his shoulder. He looked around the room, confused, until his gaze landed on the woman sleeping beside him. He remembered the ambush, he remembered the pain, and he remembered the voice that had pulled him out of the darkness. He looked at their joined hands, at the dark circles under her eyes, and realized with a jolt of terror and wonder that she had stayed. She hadn't fled while he was incapacitated. She had been his guard. For the first time in his life, the wall around his heart didn't just crack. A piece of it crumbled away completely. Chapter 16. The walls crumble. The silence in the room was heavy, but for the first time in Michael's memory, it was not oppressive. It was the comfortable, rhythmic silence of shared breathing. Michael lay still, his eyes tracing the curve of Sophia's cheek where it rested against the mattress. She was fast asleep, her breathing deep and even, a stark contrast to the chaos that had nearly claimed his life. His shoulder throbbed with a dull ache, a reminder of the wolfsbane that had coursed through his veins. But the agony was gone, replaced by a lingering weakness that frustrated him. He tried to shift his arm, and Sophia stirred instantly. Her healer's instinct was apparently sharper than her need for rest. She sat up, blinking sleep from her eyes, her hair a messy halo around her face. When she saw him awake and lucid, a look of such profound relief washed over her that Michael felt a physical tightness in his chest. He watched her, waiting for the fear. He expected her to recoil, remembering the monster that had snarled and thrashed in the war room. Instead, she reached for the pitcher of water on the nightstand, her movements steady. She poured a glass and held it to his lips, supporting his head with a gentleness he hadn't experienced since he was a pup. He drank greedily, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. When he finished, he didn't pull away. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the exhaustion etched into her features, the dark circles, the pallor of her skin. She had depleted her own vitality to save him. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow for a king who prided himself on needing no one. He asked her, his voice raspy and unused, why she had done it. He asked why she hadn't let the guards handle him, or better yet, let the poison take him and free herself from their loveless arrangement. Sophia set the glass down and looked at him with that maddeningly honest gaze. She told him that she didn't know how to let things die if she had the power to save them. She explained that she saw the man beneath the beast, and she refused to let fear dictate her actions. It wasn't a declaration of undying love, but it was a declaration of loyalty that went far beyond any treaty or contract. Michael felt the cold iron walls he had built around his heart tremble. He had spent years believing that allowing someone close meant inviting a knife to the back. But here she was, holding his hand, having pulled the knife out. He looked down at their joined fingers. His hand was large, scarred and rough. Hers was small, pale, and stained with the remnants of the herbs she had used to heal him. Slowly, testing the waters of this new reality, Michael squeezed her hand. It was a small gesture, microscopic to an outsider, but for them, it was a landslide. He didn't say thank you. Words felt inadequate and dangerous. Instead, he told her she should sleep in the bed, not on the floor or in a chair. He moved his legs, wincing slightly, making room for her beside him. It was an invitation into his space, a breaking of his own unwritten rule of isolation. Sophia hesitated only for a moment before climbing in, lying on top of the covers beside him. As she drifted back to sleep, Michael lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing with terrifying clarity that he would tear the world apart before he let anyone hurt her again. Chapter 17. Breaking Rule Number 2. Recovery was a slow, irritating process for a man used to absolute strength, but for the first time, Michael did not rush it. The days following the assassination attempt were quiet, filled with a strange, tentative peace. He spent his time in the master suite, reviewing reports on a tablet while Sophia checked his bandages and ensured he actually ate the meals Martha brought. The dynamic had shifted. The staff no longer scurried away in terror when he spoke. They saw their king allowing the healer to scold him for moving too much, and it humanized him in a way no speech ever could. On the fourth day, when his strength had returned enough to walk without a limp, Michael made a decision. He waited until evening, when the castle was settling into the hush of twilight, and extended his hand to Sophia. He led her out of the bedroom, down the main corridor, and stopped in front of the heavy, iron-bound double doors that marked the entrance to the West Wing. This was the boundary line, the threshold of Rule Number 2. Sophia stopped, looking up at him with uncertainty. She remembered his threat vividly. Anyone who entered here was a spy. Michael saw the hesitation in her eyes and hated that he had put it there. He unlocked the doors with a biometric scan of his palm and pushed them open, the hinges groaning from disuse. He gestured for her to enter first. It was a surrender. He was opening the vault. Sophia stepped inside, expecting a torture chamber or a war room. Instead, she found herself in a sprawling two-story library. It was magnificent, filled with the smell of old paper and leather. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of books, and in the center of the room sat a large desk cluttered with maps and journals. But it was the artifacts that caught her attention. On the walls hung paintings of a smiling woman and a stern man, Michael's parents. In a glass case, there was a small wooden toy wolf. This wasn't a place of dark secrets. It was a mausoleum of the boy he used to be before the world hardened him. It was his grief, preserved in amber. Michael walked to a section of the wall and pulled down a dust sheet, revealing a portrait of a young woman with striking red hair. He told Sophia, his voice devoid of emotion, that this was Alara. He explained how she had been his betrothed, the first person he thought he loved. He told her how Alara had sold the layout of his nursery to a rival pack, resulting in an attack that killed his younger brother. He watched Sophia's face, waiting for judgment or pity. He saw only sorrow. She reached out and touched his arm, not the painting. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply acknowledged that he had survived the impossible. Standing there in the sanctuary of his past, surrounded by the ghosts of his trauma, Michael realized that Sophia didn't want to steal his secrets. She wanted to help him carry them. He turned to her, his golden eyes intense, and told her that the rule was abolished. She was welcome here. She was welcome anywhere. Chapter 18. The Courtship. With the physical and emotional barriers shattered, the atmosphere in the obsidian fortress transformed. It was as if spring had finally breached the castle walls. The most shocking change, however, was in the king himself. Michael, the ruthless Lycan, had no idea how to court a wife. He had never needed to. He had been a warrior prince and then a tyrant king. But he was learning, and his attempts were as intense and clumsy as they were endearing. He stopped hunting to escape her. Instead, he began hunting for her. One afternoon, Sophia returned to their chambers to find a massive, pristine pelt of a white winter tiger draped over the foot of the bed. It was a trophy of immense value, a predator that was notoriously difficult to kill. To Michael, it was a blanket to keep her warm. To the staff, it was a declaration that the king was utterly besotted. He became possessive in a way that walked the line between protective and obsessive. He refused to let her eat alone. Every meal was taken together, and he would often pile the choicest cuts of meat onto her plate, frowning until she finished them, convinced she was too thin. He started accompanying her to the gardens, which were now beginning to show signs of life thanks to her care. He would stand guard by the gate, arms crossed, glaring at any bird or squirrel that got too close, while she laughed and planted bulbs. The sight of the Blood King looming over a patch of blooming daffodils became a common, if surreal, sight for the castle guards. But it was the smaller moments that truly defined this new era. He started leaving her gifts that showed he was paying attention. A heavy cloak lined with velvet because she had shivered in the drafty hall. A rare book on ancient medicinal herbs he had dispatched a squad to retrieve from a city 300 miles away. He was trying to buy her happiness because he didn't know how to ask for her love. Sophia, for her part, accepted these gestures with grace, but she pushed back gently. She forced him to talk to her, to sit in the garden without checking his perimeter, to listen to the wind without searching for enemies. The climax of this awkward courtship came during a stormy evening. Michael found Sophia in the library reading. He stood before her, shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking like a cadet facing a tribunal. He pulled a small, velvet-wrapped object from his pocket. It wasn't a jewel or a weapon. It was a locket, old silver, tarnished, but beautiful. He told her it had belonged to his mother. He said he hadn't touched it in 20 years because it hurt too much, but he wanted her to have it because she was the only thing that made the memories bearable. Sophia stood, tears pricking her eyes, and let him fasten the cold metal around her neck. When his fingers brushed her skin, the bond hummed between them, no longer a jagged bolt of lightning, but a steady, warm current. He wasn't just courting her, he was surrendering to her, piece by jagged piece. Chapter 19. The Bond Snaps. The storm that had been threatening the coast for days finally made landfall, battering the obsidian fortress with gale-force winds and rain that lashed against the stone like gravel. Thunder shook the foundations of the castle, mirroring the tension that had coiled tight within the master suite. They had retired early, the noise of the storm making conversation difficult, but sleep was impossible. The air in the room was charged, heavy with the static of the storm and the undeniable magnetic pull of the mate bond that had been simmering between them for weeks. Michael stood by the window, watching the lightning illuminate the jagged peaks of his territory. He was restless, the beast under his skin reacting to the barometric pressure and the scent of the woman sitting on the edge of the bed. Sophia watched him. The fear she had once felt for him was a distant memory, replaced by a longing that frightened her in a different way. She stood up and crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the rug. She stopped behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against the broad expanse of his back. Michael stiffened, then relaxed, covering her hands with his own. He turned in her arms, the movement fluid and predatory, trapping her against the cold glass of the window. The lightning flashed, illuminating the hunger in his eyes, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. He told her, his voice a rough growl that vibrated in her chest, that he couldn't keep his distance anymore. He confessed that he had tried to be noble, to wait until she was ready, but his control was fraying. Sophia didn't retreat. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. She told him there was no need to wait. She told him she chose him. Not the king, not the savior, but him. The kiss that followed was in collision. It was desperate and messy, fueled by months of fear, anger, and suppressed desire. Michael lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to the bed as if she weighed nothing. The storm outside raged, but it was nothing compared to the tempest in the room. He worshipped her body with a reverence that bordered on religious, his touch searing her skin, marking her as his in every way that mattered. When the moment of completion came, it wasn't just physical. As they joined together, the mate bond snapped into place with a force that made them both gasp. It was a metaphysical locking of souls, a sensation of a door slamming shut, and a bridge being built simultaneously. Sophia felt his emotions flood her mind, his fierce protectiveness, his lingering self-doubt, and the overwhelming, terrifying depth of his love for her. Michael felt her empathy, her strength, and her absolute acceptance of his darkness. They lay tangled together in the aftermath, the storm quieting outside, their breathing synchronizing. Michael buried his face in her neck, inhaling her scent which now carried the permanent, underlying note of his mark. They were no longer two broken people sharing a castle. They were one entity, bound by blood and magic, stronger than they had ever been apart. Chapter 20. The Conspiracy. While the king and his new queen basked in the glow of their union, darkness was gathering in the valleys beyond the fortress. Lord Vane had not left the territory after the summit. He had lingered at a border lodge, claiming engine trouble with his convoy, while his spies did their work. He stood on the balcony of the lodge, looking toward the distant silhouette of the obsidian fortress, swirling a glass of amber liquor. His second-in-command, a scarred wolf named Kale, stepped out of the shadows to deliver his report. The news was exactly what Vane had hoped for, yet it was more dangerous than he anticipated. Kale reported that the king was distracted. He wasn't patrolling the borders with his usual paranoia. He was spending hours in the gardens, neglecting the council meetings, and had even dismissed his personal guard from the royal wing. The tribute bride had done the impossible. She had domesticated the beast. Vane smiled, a cold, humorless expression. He had initially planned to use the lack of an heir as a political lever to force Michael's abdication. But this was better. An heir was a concept. A beloved wife was a hostage. Vane realized that Michael's strength had always been his lack of attachments. He had been invincible because he had nothing to lose. Now he had a heart beating outside of his chest, and that made him mortal. The plan shifted. They wouldn't assassinate the king. That had failed, and would only create a martyr. They would take the queen. Vane outlined the strategy to Kale. They needed to separate Michael from the fortress. A direct assault on the castle while the Lycan was present would be suicide. They needed a distraction, something that would trigger Michael's old instincts and pull him away from Sophia's side. Vane authorized the activation of a sleeper cell in the northern mining district. They would stage a violent uprising, a rebellion funded by Vane's gold, but painted to look like a rogue incursion. It would be brutal enough to demand the king's personal attention. 3 days later, the call came. Reports of a massacre at the northern mines reached the fortress. 12 guards dead, infrastructure burning, and rumors of a rogue army gathering to march south. Michael received the news in the war room, his face darkening with the old rage. He didn't want to leave. The bond urged him to stay close to Sophia, to keep her within arm's reach. But he was a king before he was a husband, and he could not let his people be slaughtered. He made the fatal error of assuming the threat was external. He kissed Sophia goodbye at the gates, surrounding her with a triple guard of his best men, promising to return in 2 days. As his convoy roared away, Disappearing into the tree line, Sophia watched him go, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She didn't know it yet, but the fortress walls were no longer enough to keep the danger out, because the danger had been watching and waiting for the king to leave the key in the door. Chapter 21. Taken. The absence of King Michael left a vacuum in the obsidian fortress that felt more suffocating than his actual presence ever had. For 2 days, the castle seemed to hold its breath, the usual bustle of the staff replaced by a hushed, anxious waiting. Sophia tried to maintain her routine to keep the rising panic at bay, but the silence of the mate bond was a constant, nagging void in the back of her mind. She could feel him, a distant, burning ember of concentration hundreds of miles away at the northern mines, but the lack of his immediate proximity left her feeling exposed, like a crab that had lost its shell. She retreated to the only place where she felt a semblance of peace: the royal gardens. The high stone walls usually offered comfort, but today, under the gray, overcast sky, they felt uncomfortably like the perimeter of a cage. Sophia knelt in the damp earth, her hands busy tending to a bed of aconite and foxglove. She had insisted on cultivating a section for medicinal poisons, arguing that a healer needed to understand the weapon to create the cure. Her triple guard detail stood near the iron gate, their postures rigid, scanning the horizon. They were Michael's elite, handpicked to ensure her safety, yet they didn't see the threat because it didn't come from the horizon. It came from the sky. A soft, metallic clatter drew Sophia's attention to the far wall, just as 3 silver canisters arched over the stone barrier and landed in the grass with a dull thud. Before she could stand, they hissed violently, spewing a dense, colorless vapor that rolled across the ground with unnatural speed. "Gas! Masks on!" the lead guard shouted, reaching for his tactical belt, but he was too slow. The gas was a neurotoxin, fast-acting and brutal. The guards crumpled where they stood, their bodies seizing as the paralytic agent overwhelmed their systems. Sophia scrambled backward, covering her nose and mouth with the hem of her heavy wool dress, her heart hammering against her ribs. She ran toward the greenhouse, seeking the filtered ventilation system, but the garden service gate, a gate that was supposed to be bio-locked and guarding the rear, burst open. It wasn't forced. It was unlocked from the inside. A figure in a castle uniform stood there, holding the keypad, his face masked by a respirator. It was the sector lieutenant she had brought coffee to just yesterday. The betrayal stung worse than the chemical burn of the gas now stinging her eyes. 4 mercenaries in black tactical gear stormed through the open breach, moving with the terrifying efficiency of an extraction team that had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Sophia didn't scream. She fought. She grabbed a heavy ceramic pot containing a prickly cactus and hurled it at the first attacker, striking him in the helmet. He stumbled, but the others closed the distance instantly. Rough, gloved hands seized her arms, twisting them behind her back with enough force to make her shoulder pop. She kicked out, landing a solid blow on a shin, but then she felt the sharp prick of a needle jamming into the side of her neck. A cold sensation flooded her veins, turning her blood to ice and her limbs to lead. As her vision tunneled into darkness, she gathered every ounce of fear and love she possessed and screamed Michael's name through the silent frequency of their bond, a psychic distress flare meant to burn him. Miles away, deep in the soot-stained valley of the northern mines, King Michael was in the middle of interrogating a captured rebel leader. The air was filled with the smell of burning machinery and dust. Suddenly, Michael stopped mid-sentence. His entire body went rigid, his eyes widening as the psychic impact of Sophia's terror slammed into him. It was a physical blow that dropped him to one knee, clutching his chest as if he had been shot. The soldiers around him stepped back in confusion, but their confusion turned to horror as a low, guttural sound ripped from the king's throat. It wasn't a word. It was the sound of a predator realizing its mate had been taken. He didn't issue orders. He didn't wait for transport. He shifted instantly, his clothes shredding as the massive black Lycan erupted from his human form, tearing off toward the south with a speed that cracked the pavement beneath his claws. Chapter 22. The Healer in Hell. Consciousness returned to Sophia slowly, dragging her up from the depths of a chemically induced stupor. Her first sensation was cold, a biting, damp chill that seeped through her clothes and settled into her marrow. She groaned, trying to lift her hand to her throbbing head, but metal clinked against stone, arresting the movement. She blinked her eyes open, forcing them to focus through the gloom. She was sitting on the floor of a dungeon cell, her wrists bound in front of her with heavy, etched cuffs. The metal burned against her skin with a low-level, feverish heat, silver, enchanted to suppress a shifter's strength. The room smelled of stagnant water, rust, and the unmistakable copper tang of old misery. This wasn't the obsidian fortress. The stone here was porous and crumbling, the architecture ancient and neglected. "I was told you were soft," a voice echoed from the shadows beyond the bars. "But you didn't scream when you woke up. Disappointing." Lord Vane stepped into the pool of dim light cast by a single flickering bulb. He looked pristine in a tailored suit that clashed violently with the filth of the dungeon, holding a datapad loosely in one hand. He pulled up a wooden stool and sat down just out of reach, watching her like a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. He explained his grievances with a calm, terrifying rationality. He spoke of Michael's refusal to expand their territories, his obsession with border security over conquest, and now, his weakness for a discarded healer from a broken pack. Vane didn't hate Sophia. He simply viewed her as a lever to be pulled to topple a throne. He slid the datapad through the rusty bars across the floor. It stopped inches from her knees. On the screen was a script, a plea for Michael to abdicate the throne and surrender the Obsidian territory to Vane's coalition in exchange for her safe return. Vane ordered her to pick it up and read it into the camera, instructing her to look pathetic, to cry if she could manage it. Sophia stared at the device, her mind racing. She knew Michael. If he saw her begging, he might actually surrender to save her, and that would destroy the realm. She picked up the tablet, looked directly into the camera lens, and then smashed the device against the stone floor with all the strength she had left. Glass shattered, and the screen went black. She looked up at Vane, her voice raspy but steady, telling him that he had misunderstood the nature of his king. Michael would not kneel for a hostage. He would burn the world down to retrieve her. Vane's composed mask slipped, a flash of genuine anger twisting his features. He stood up and backhanded the young guard standing near the cell door, a boy barely out of his teens who had snickered at the broken tablet. The ring on Vane's finger tore open a jagged gash on the boy's forearm. Vane cursed at him for the incompetence of the security team and stormed out, leaving Sophia alone with the bleeding guard. The boy clutched his arm, his face pale, blood dripping onto the dirty floor. Sophia watched him, her healer's instinct warring with her self-preservation. She shifted closer to the bars. "That cut is deep," she whispered, her voice soft. "If you don't clean it, the rust in this place will give you tetanus within a day." The boy looked at her, startled. He expected threats or silence, not medical advice. Sophia ripped a strip of clean fabric from her petticoat, offering it through the bars. She told him to come closer. He hesitated, terrified of Vane, but the pain won out. He stepped within reach. Sophia didn't try to steal his keys. She worked quickly, her fingers deft despite the cuffs, binding the wound and applying pressure. As she worked, she spoke to him, not as a prisoner to a jailer, but as a person. She asked him if Vane's ambition was worth dying of an infection in a dark hole. She saw the doubt enter his eyes, the crack in his loyalty, and she knew that while she couldn't fight her way out, she might be able to heal her way into an escape. Chapter 23. The Slaughter Lord Vane's stronghold was a fortress designed to withstand modern warfare, tucked deep within a valley protected by natural choke points. The perimeter was lined with electric fencing, motion sensors, and heavy machine gun nests manned by mercenaries who had fought in conflicts across the globe. They were professional, disciplined, and heavily armed. They were prepared for a tactical assault team or a rival pack's militia. They were not prepared for a natural disaster made of flesh and fur. The attack did not begin with a negotiation or a warning shot. It began when a massive, armored transport vehicle, rigged with explosives, roared out of the tree line at 80 miles an hour and rammed directly into the reinforced main gates. The explosion was deafening. A fireball that lit up the valley floor and vaporized the iron gates, sending shrapnel raining down like deadly hail. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, a shadow launched itself through the burning wreckage. King Michael, fully shifted into his colossal Lycan form, moved with a speed that defied physics for a creature of his size. He was a blur of black fur and lethal intent. The mercenaries in the courtyard opened fire, the staccato rhythm of automatic weapons filling the air. Bullets sparked off the Lycan's thick hide or embedded in muscle without slowing him down. He didn't seek cover. He didn't flank. He charged straight into the teeth of the defense. Michael collided with the first line of guards like a freight train hitting a sedan. He swiped a massive claw, sending 2 armored men flying through the air with their rib cages shattered. He bit through the barrel of a rifle and the arm holding it in one motion. The roar that tore from his throat was not just a sound. It was a weapon that vibrated in the bones of every living thing within a mile. It promised extinction. The mercenaries, realizing their weapons were useless against an enraged royal Lycan, broke rank. Panic spread faster than the fire at the gate. Men dropped their weapons and ran, only to be hunted down by the blur of darkness that seemed to be everywhere at once. Inside the manor, the sound of the slaughter outside echoed through the stone halls like the approach of doomsday. Michael breached the heavy oak front doors by simply running through them, taking the frame and a chunk of the wall with him. His vision was tinted red, a tunnel focusing only on the scent of lavender and fear that pulled him downward. He ignored the opulent furniture, smashing through tables and statues as he followed the scent. A group of Vane's personal wolf guard attempted to hold the hallway leading to the stairs. They shifted to meet him, but they were regular wolves against a Lycan king. The fight lasted seconds. Michael tore through them with brutal efficiency, snapping necks and tossing bodies aside as if they were dolls. He didn't stop to kill the wounded. He didn't care about them. His mind chanted a single mantra. Mine. 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 He reached the heavy steel blast door that led to the lower dungeon levels. It was locked with a biometric scanner. Michael didn't look for a key card or a finger. He dug his claws into the seam of the metal door, his muscles bulging and veins popping under his fur as he pulled. With a screech of tearing metal that sounded like a dying banshee, the steel buckled and ripped from its hinges. He tossed the door aside and descended into the darkness, the scent of Sophia growing stronger, mixing with the acrid smell of Vane's terror. He burst into the torture chamber, his chest heaving, saliva dripping from his jaws. A monster from the deepest pits of hell come to reclaim his heart. Chapter 24. The Queen of Hearts. The scene in the dungeon froze in a tableau of absolute tension. Lord Vane stood with his back to the far wall, using Sophia as a human shield. His arm was hooked tight around her neck, choking her slightly, and a silver-bladed combat knife was pressed deep into the soft skin under her jaw, drawing a thin bead of blood. Facing them, filling the shattered doorway with his massive bulk, was the Lycan. Michael was vibrating with kinetic energy, his claws digging deep furrows into the stone floor, a low, continuous growl rumbling in his chest like an idling engine. His golden eyes were fixated on the knife. His pupils dilated so wide the eyes appeared almost black. "Stay back," Vane screamed, his voice cracking, abandoning all pretense of aristocracy. "One step and I open her throat. I want to chop her. I want safe passage to the coast. Ideally, a hostage situation required negotiation, calm voices, and de-escalation. But Michael wasn't listening to the words. He was calculating the distance and the speed of Vane's pulse, which he could hear thumping frantically against the traitor's ribs. Sophia felt the tremble in Vane's arm. She saw the madness in Michael's eyes and knew that if Michael moved, Vane would flinch, and the knife would kill her. She had to be the variable Vane didn't account for. She waited for Vane to inhale for his next scream. In that split second of breath, she acted. She didn't try to pull away. She dropped her entire body weight, going dead weight in his arm while simultaneously driving the heel of her boot viciously down onto the arch of Vane's foot. As he gasped, she rammed her elbow backward with precise, anatomically targeted force into his solar plexus. It wasn't a move of strength, but of leverage. Vane's reflex was involuntary. He doubled over, the knife skittering away from her neck for a fraction of a second. That fraction was all Michael needed. He crossed the room in a blur of motion that the eye couldn't track. He didn't bite Vane. He backhanded him. The blow connected with the force of a sledgehammer, lifting Vane off his feet and sending him flying across the cell. He smashed into the opposite stone wall with a sickening crunch of bone and slid to the floor, unconscious and broken. Michael didn't look at him again. He scrambled toward Sophia, his form shimmering and shrinking mid-stride until he was human, naked, covered in dust and the blood of his enemies, crashing to his knees before her. He hovered his hands over her, terrified to touch her, his chest heaving as he hyperventilated. "Sophia," he choked out, his voice wrecked. "I have you. I have you." He looked at the red mark on her neck and let out a sob of pure anguish. Sophia, despite the bruises on her wrists and the exhaustion dragging her down, reached out. She cupped his face, her thumbs wiping away a streak of war paint that wasn't his. "I know," she whispered, pulling him down to her. "I knew you would come." The ruthless king collapsed against her, burying his face in the crook of her neck, shaking violently as the adrenaline crashed, holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a universe of chaos. 6 months later, the harsh winter that had defined the arrival of the tribute bride was a distant memory, replaced by the vibrant, persistent green of high summer. The obsidian fortress, once a monolith of fear, had undergone a transformation that mirrored its master. The heavy velvet drapes in the great hall were permanently tied back, allowing sunlight to flood the stone corridors. In the lower bailey, the sound of construction filled the air. A new hospital wing and a school for the Pax pups were being built, projects commissioned and overseen by Queen Sophia. In the royal gardens, now a riot of blooming color and buzzing life, Michael sat on a stone bench. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal faint scars that were no longer hidden. He was reading a council report, but his eyes kept drifting. A few yards away, Sophia was kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by a group of young healers from neighboring packs who had come to learn her techniques. She was laughing at something one of the students said, her hands caked in soil, a smudge of dirt on her nose. Michael set the report down, realizing he hadn't read a word in 10 minutes. He touched the spot over his heart. The icy fortress he had built within himself was gone, dismantled stone by stone. In its place was a warmth that radiated through the bond, a constant, steady hum of connection. He watched his wife stand up and brush the dirt from her dress, catching his eye with a bright, knowing smile. He stood and walked toward her, not as the Blood King or the tyrant, but as a man who had finally found his peace. He took her hand, interlacing their fingers, and as they walked back toward the castle together, Michael knew that his greatest victory hadn't been on a battlefield. It had been surrendering to the love that had saved him from himself.